Dr. Fletcher is a seasoned tech executive, award-winning marketing influencer, board member, angel investor. So if you want to get her afterwards to get some money out of her, she'll have to go through you to get out. And speaker. She writes for entrepreneur.com, The Guardian, one of my favorite publications, The Huffington Post, The Digitalist, and contributed to and been featured in Forbes magazine, Fortune, Newsweek, and The Muse. Named Brown Brother Harriman's 18 Women to Watch in 2018. Dr. Fletcher speaks globally on diversity and inclusion. And it is my honor to bring her up and introduce her to speak to you.
Thank you. Wow. Congratulations for showing up on a Friday morning on the last day of a conference. Good morning, everybody. For as long as I can remember, I have had this fascination with my grandmother. My sisters and I called her Little Nana because she was about 4'9", as opposed to my other grandmother, who was all of 5'2", who we called Big Nana, only to realize after she died, she hated that name. I don't know why. But there's my grandmother right there. It's a little bit of a fuzzy picture, and I'll tell you about this picture in a few minutes. But I was fascinated by her. Her name was Arshaloos Tasjan, and my mother was a working mother before working mothers were a thing. So I spent most days with my grandmother. We'd walk through the streets of Dorchester at the time where I was born and somewhat raised. We'd walk to the beach. She would teach me Armenian songs and Turkish songs, and she would make me the most incredible Armenian food, and I loved being with her. Because whenever I was with her, I felt like the most special person in the world. But despite all of this time with my grandmother, I knew very little about her. She always focused in on the person or people she was with. And in fact, the only stuff I knew about her, about the woman she was, were a few bullet points that my mother shared with me. I knew that she was born in 1915, Harput, Turkey, Armenia. I knew that her father had passed away before she was born. I knew she was the youngest of 9 children. I knew that her mother had passed away shortly after her death. And I knew that she had immigrated to the United States when she was 19 to be in an arranged marriage with my grandfather, who was unfortunately not a very nice man. My curiosity about my grandmother, it only grew after she died. I was a full-grown adult by then, but I was so curious about her. And so I started to do a lot of research. And because she came from a country who changed everything, they changed the name of cities, they got rid of a lot of documentation from that time in the 1900s, I really couldn't find out much information. About that time, I was working for a company, SAP. Some of you may have heard of them. And I spent my life, essentially, if you had asked my daughters at the time, talking on the phone, laughing, yelling at my computer, and flying around the world. That's pretty much what I did. So there I was, no time, right? Flying on those airplanes, yelling at my computer, yakking it up on the phone, 2 little kids at home, no time at all, right? Couldn't work out, didn't really have anything. And I decided now would be the perfect time to add on a PhD program. It was perfect. And so I did that because I wanted to learn how to research like a scholar. So there I was. I was about a year into my proposal, and anybody who has done a PhD or who has been with someone who's done a PhD knows that your dissertation proposal is as nerve-wracking, if not more, than the actual research itself. And I was so excited about my topic. At the time, we were focused in on really the start of big data, right, and dashboards. And I was part of this research where there were people who were doing net new development. They were from different parts of the world. We had never seen each other face to face. So my focus, my dissertation focus was transformational leadership in virtual environments with net new technology build, right? And I know you guys appreciate that based on where you're coming from project management. Everybody else snores when I bring that up, but I love that topic and I still do. So there I was, almost done with the actual course load, right? Like I said, a year of my time into this proposal. When I take this class around feminist leadership theory, it was forced on me. It was a check the box, something I had to do as part of the program. I grew up in Pembroke, Massachusetts. I was, like I said, born in Dorchester, Mass, but raised in Pembroke, Massachusetts. Very conservative family. I had the Armenian mother, and I had a very typical Boston Irish meat and potatoes 1950s kind of dad. Super conservative. He raised me, my mother raised me to believe that a feminist was somebody who was an or person, men or women. And I just never saw myself that way. So I didn't identify with this topic at all. I went into it, quite frankly, kicking and screaming. So there I was, first day of class, and I was introduced to this woman. How many of you know who Dr. Carol Gilligan is? Awesome. Yeah, she kicks ass. So Carol Gilligan is the founder of feminist leadership theory, and she changed my life. And I'm not a starstruck kind of person. I'm very fortunate to meet people just based on the work that I do. And I think I would be tongue-tied if I ever met this woman. Carol Gilligan, as part of her PhD program, her research, which she did at Harvard some decades ago, she studied under Lawrence Kohlberg, and she was a research assistant for him when he was doing research that ended up with the 6 stages of moral development. Are you guys familiar with what that is? It's pretty much in every business school program, right? It's essentially, how do we make value-based decisions? And Kohlberg's research showed us that decisions, the best value-based decisions, are made based on justice, rules, and hierarchy. Those are the traits that our business systems are based on. Every way we make a decision is based on that. It's essentially an A to B decision, right? Very transactional. So Gilligan did this research with him, helped him with the findings, but she had a problem with this. So much so that the first thing she did as part of her postdoctoral research was to replicate the study. But this time she did it differently. You see, when Kohlberg did years and years and years of this research, the only participants he used were white men. That's it. And it kind of makes sense at the time, because every single leadership position in the majority of developed economies was held by white men. And she thought, wow, I can't really resonate, right? This whole way of making decisions, it doesn't resonate with me. So she does the research, and she does it with female participants. And what she found was that people with female leadership traits, and it's important, I'm not talking about all women and all men. These are really gender traits. Some of us have a mixture. I do. I have both male and female traits, and so do each of you. And what she studied, what she found from studying these women, are that women make decisions based on relations. I decide I'm going to invest in here, I'm going to turn down that project, I'm going to add in a new market, go after these customers. And when I consider these decisions, I consider them in relation to the stakeholders who are most impacted. Many believe that Gilligan was like Kohlberg. You see, Kohlberg believed that because of his research, because of what he found, that those male traits around justice, rules, and hierarchy, that those were superior, morally superior than any other form of decision-making. Gilligan said, not so fast. We do need those kinds of A to B decision-making. But the truth is, when it comes to innovation, when it comes to being able to bring people together to create the new cool stuff, probably many of the things that you work on as part of your work, we need diversity. But what we mostly need is a focus on people. Think about it. Do brick buildings do business with brick buildings? No. People do business with people. When we make decisions, when you make decisions every day about the projects you're leading, the human, the financial resources that you have into play, that you are organizing and orchestrating, it's all about people. So here I am learning about Gilligan, and then that first day I realized just how dumb and unobservant I was. You see, I was really used to being the only woman in the room. I had an unconscious bias around that, so much so that I never really thought about it. When I was in grad school, I was always the only woman in certain classes that I took. Same with my doctorate, certainly the same in my career in technology and enterprise technology. I was taught to focus in on things like working for this big German company with a bunch of PhD physicists, that I was the only American. I was the youngest one. I was the only dumb marketing person who didn't know how to code. It never occurred to me to look up beside me and down and see that there were no other women. And I thought to myself, that's really strange. At the time, I was doing a lot of customer-facing work, and pretty much every customer, every influencer, every decision maker was a woman. Right? Crazy. And yet, the people who were deciding what our products were, how they would interact with people, how we would market them, were all men. It doesn't make a lot of sense to have the products and services that are out there in the market, and the people, more importantly, who not only buy them but use them, not be reflected in the organization. The other thing I realized was, as I looked up, there were no women at those key decision-making positions. So I decided to scrap an entire year that I put into my dissertation proposal. My husband didn't talk to me for a week. Most people were pretty disgusted with me. And I decided to change my proposal. And instead, my research focused in on being a phenomenological study of women who hold board of director positions in publicly held life sciences and technology businesses. There were about 15 of them at the time. Unfortunately, the numbers aren't that different today. And because of some wonderful relationships, I was able to speak with each of them. These women were incredible. They were just like me. They weren't all the Sheryl Sandbergs, right? They weren't born with a silver spoon in their mouth. They didn't go to the top tier schools. They didn't come from super connected families. Most of them grew up in farms in the middle of the country, came from somewhere else. And yet, these women made it to where so few other people have made it inside a boardroom, right? Not just women, but men also not making it there. And I had to understand, how did they do it? And they did it because they created a platform, because they were fueled by purpose, not position, because they knew that they could use their voices, use their relationships, their social capital in order to bring the change to the market that they wanted to see. It was about this time that I started learning more about my family. And what I learned about my family, my grandmother's family, was at odds with these powerful women. I learned that that picture you saw, which I had never seen until this research, was of my grandmother in a Syrian refugee camp. I learned that her father didn't die from a snake bite, which is what my mother had told me. And in fact, when my grandmother's mother was about 6 months pregnant with my grandmother, my great-grandfather was taken away by some Turkish soldiers from the Ottoman Empire and killed. They had done a first roundup in 1915 of the scholars who would then educate their village people about what was going on, so they had to get rid of them. I learned that when my grandmother was about 6 months old, her mother had found out that the Ottoman Empire soldiers were coming to their part of Harput to kill everybody or drive them out of the city. So you can imagine this woman with 9 kids, 8 of whom still lived in Turkey, full of hormones and fear, just lost her husband. What does she do? She wants to save her children's lives. She sent her 12 and 13-year-old daughter, my great aunts, to church to pray, the teen brothers to the mountains with sticks and rocks to defend themselves. My grandmother at 6 months old, she hid in a bureau drawer, and her 8-year-old daughter, she hid somewhere in the home. She went outside of their home, waved her arms, made a ruckus, and she was killed, and in fact hung in the middle of her village as a symbol of what happens when you fight back. But she did save her children's lives. What I was kind of came to at the end of finding all of this out, I was told that my grandmother didn't make a noise that day. And it occurred to me, there's this woman who had these tragic things happen to her, who was put into an arranged marriage with a man who ended up being quite abusive, that was the day at 6 months old she realized that in order to stay alive, she had to be quiet. Think about that. So here I was, studying all these incredible women, doing whatever the heck I wanted to do. And I came from a lineage of women who didn't have a voice, who were powerful. Her sisters, with the church they were in, it was burnt down. The soldiers would burn down these churches. Armenians are very, very Christian. Would burn down these churches knowing there was one door out. They would wait for people to flee. They captured my 12 and 13-year-old grandaunts and gave them a choice. Marry this high-ranking Armenian official and his brother, who, by the way, were in their 50s, in order to give their siblings a shot at marching to Syria, where 1 million other Armenians died, or be killed. They chose to marry, right? So I have all these women I come from, powerful, but they had no power. And I knew I was put here for a purpose. And that purpose was to give voice so that all of us have the opportunity to thrive, not just some of us. So Carol Gilligan, here she is, telling me that we have these decisions, ways of making decisions, which were at odds with how I was taught in the business world to make decisions. Here I was learning along the way how much power women really have. Women are responsible for 80 to 90% of all consumer purchase decisions, from the health care that we have, to the vacations that we take, to the products we use. We are responsible in this country for 51% of the wealth. Incredible, right? When it comes to startups, women, by the way, only get 2% of external funding, right? VC funding, private equity funding for their startups, and yet they represent 65% of positive exits. Women have power, but they are not in power. We're only 4% of Fortune 500 CEOs. It's crazy, right? But yet we are half of bachelor's degrees, half of MBAs, 70% of PhDs, 70% of valedictorians. So you look and you go, wait a minute, this doesn't make a lot of sense. And growing up at SAP, and you will appreciate this because of the work that you do, I look at everything as a system of processes. And what I was taught to do at SAP was to say, what made this possible? Kind of like, how many of you remember a few months ago in Hawaii when they had that missile crisis that turned out to be nothing, right? It was essentially somebody pressed a wrong button. It was panic. Any of you who have been to Hawaii can absolutely understand that. You're 6,000 miles away from any kind of civilization. There's nowhere to go. And just like the military at the time did the right thing, what made this possible? You can't turn it off. You can't push another button. I couldn't help but think that was the problem that I had to solve. So there I was. I finished my PhD. My gosh, I was just so full of it. I'm in an extremely innovative industry. I thought, okay, look, by now we all get it, right? The more diverse a population of people, the more innovation that we get. Everybody can see who it is we're selling to. Come on, developers, let's get on board, right? I was going to lead the charge. It was going to be beautiful. It was going to be amazing. but it wasn't. So my first thing that I did was I decided to host a panel at a developer conference. And this developer conference was based on a community of about 2 million enterprise software developers. Only about 8% of that community were women. So I hosted a panel at this conference, and the panel was around driving in gender equity into the enterprise developer software community. And I knew some of these folks in the audience. Some of them were friends. Lots of them were really supportive. So there I was with my awesome panel of men and women, and I'm all in, right? I'm telling them, I'm asking the questions about the stuff that I found out. What can we do to get more women? Look at the audience, right? There were like 3 women. I think they were the event staff. You know, it was just, right? It was crazy. So I'm all in, it's great. And a few minutes later, I look, and people are leaving. About halfway through, half the room was there. And by the end, it truly was me and the people serving the food. And that was about it, right? And the people on the stage. And over the days that followed, I started getting hate email and nasty blogs written about me. I was hurt, I was upset, and quite frankly, I was pissed off. And so that one of the community managers was, you know, take a few days, lick your wounds, and go find out what happened. Go find out what made this possible. So I did just that. And just imagine being somebody who's hiding behind a keyboard and writing a nasty email to somebody and have that person, the recipient, call you up on the telephone. That was me. And so that's what I did. I wanted to find out, why were they so angry? Why did they leave the room? Why didn't they join the conversation? And what I found out was that I made a cardinal sin. I created blame and shame. The truth of the matter is, women don't need to be fixed to be more like men, and men don't need to change to be more sensitive. We live in a one-size-fits-all, where it's Kohlberg's way of making decisions or nothing. So, because I am a transformational leadership scholar and practitioner, and transformational leadership, for those of you who don't know what that means or what that is it's someone who leads others in disrupting a status quo and making a new status quo. It's more than just change management, it's transformational. Not just the processes change, but the culture, right? The things you believe have to change. And I knew one of the best things that you can do is to meet people where they are in order to get them where they need to be. So with the men I reached out to, and by the way, there were a few women who didn't want to be associated with me either, so of course I reached out to them. That was fun. So some of those men are now some of the best feminists I know. But the ones who I was able to meet where they were the ones who had daughters. Where just having the conversation with them, giving them the numbers, letting them know as an example that according to the World Economic Forum, it is going to be another 217 years. 217 years until we have parity among the genders. Are you busy in 217 years? Yeah, me too. So, right, we're kind of busy. Their challenge was realizing the harsh truth. Something has to change. Otherwise, my daughter will not have the same opportunities as my son. So, what are we going to do about it? How are we going to change the landscape when it comes to equity? There are 150 different unconscious biases at play at our brains at any given time, just at work. There are thousands playing in our brains pretty much all the time. Those are informed by things like where you grew up, when you grew up, where you went to school, the people you hang around with, right? The background that you have, the cultural background, and absolutely the gender that you are. And the thing about unconscious bias is they're unconscious, right? We don't know anything about them. We don't know when we're feeling it. A few years ago, I was at an influencer summit doing a fireside chat with a chief diversity officer from one of the world's largest technology companies. And she said something on stage that I'll never forget. Again, this woman is responsible for bringing in diverse populations, underrepresented populations, for changing the culture to be inclusive. And let me stop there for a second. There's a lot of throwing around of the terms diversity and inclusion, and they're used interchangeably. Who here can provide us a definition of diversity and a definition of inclusion? Anyone? Friday morning? Anyone? Raise your hand. No? Okay. Good thing I like to talk, because I'll do it for you. All right, so diversity is essentially about numbers, right? I have this many people who are veterans, this many people who are women, this many people who have Asperger's, right? Whatever that underrepresented population is. Many companies stop there. That's why they don't keep talent, because it's all about inclusion, about creating practices that address those unconscious biases where we think that every developer is biologically a male, every teacher more conducive to being a female. It's BS, right? It's absolute BS. So inclusion means that we go from an or, exclusive, only this type of person who makes these kinds of decisions and works in this kind of way, and by the way, looks exactly like the person I see in the mirror, to welcoming, embracing, making room for everyone. Because we absolutely need a mix of different types of thought in order to be innovative. But here's the problem. How many of you are people managers in addition to being project managers? Anyone? Yeah. And then the rest of you manage people through projects? Is it? Yeah. So we all know this. It's incredibly difficult to manage a diverse team, isn't it? Right? It's so hard. We can stand up here with our PowerPoints and be all fancy, but it's incredibly difficult because it's hard to come to a conclusion. And when you are event and time driven, it's very, very hard. All you need to do is hit your milestones. So that inclusion part is difficult. And also keep in mind that 75% of large-scale transformation, in other words, cultural plus process, 75% fail. Fail. Because we focus only on the processes, but not on the people, the values that dictate how I go through a process, how I achieve my milestones. All of it informed by those 150 unconscious biases. So back to the Chief Diversity Officer. So we're sitting on stage, and she had just flown over from Europe, and she was talking about how she was going over Iceland. And for those of you who have flown over Iceland, you know no matter what time of year, it's incredibly turbulent. It's terrifying. And just to terrify you guys, I used to travel a lot with this guy who was a Navy fighter pilot. He was incredible, but he had a fear of heights. I'll never understand it. Anyway, so we're going over Iceland, and this was a few years before, and it's so turbulent, and I fly all the time, right? You'd think I'd be used to it, but I was, hanging on for dear life. And he looked over to me and he said, Patti, they don't really know what keeps a plane in the air. Good luck. Yeah. Thanks. So there we were up on the fireside chat, and she shares this story, which made her incredibly vulnerable and made me like her so much more. And that was, during that turbulence, a voice came over, and it was the captain. And the captain was a woman. She explained, if you've ever flown Lufthansa, all German pilots and captains, and Germans love language and are very pointed with their language, and they tell you the truth. I prefer Americans who don't. So they tell you the truth. And she hears that it's a woman, and she thinks, oh God, I wish it was a man. It's a big plane. as if some He-Man's gonna emerge from the ocean, right, and hold the plane, and that's, by the way, how they stay up in the air, right, and then land it safely to where we were in Orlando. I thought, oh my gosh, I wonder if I would do the same. So how do we address unconscious bias? Well, there's a thing called decision interruption. When you're making a decision, you don't even know that your answer, which dictates your actions, is fueled by unconscious bias. The only way to challenge that unconscious bias is through decision interruption. We don't have little elves that sit next to us and say, excuse me, why are you putting that person on this project? Why are you treating her differently than they're treating with him? Growing up in enterprise tech, I've been focused in on using machine learning and artificial intelligence to solve this challenge. And it was a question of, where the heck do we start, right? The majority of customers I work with, large, global, very old cultures, very old processes and systems, very, very hard to change things like your HR systems, your SRM systems, your PLM systems, right? All of that stuff when it comes to people. I ended up meeting a woman called Dr. Elizabeth Kellen. She's from Cranfield University, and she focused in on the glass ceiling, but at a different level than I did. I had it at that board level, right, where I thought, these are the people who are going to solve everything, and every qualified talent is going to get to where they want to go and do what they want to do, regardless of gender, race, whatever. But yet, the truth of the matter is, it's been, gosh, over a decade since I've done my research. Not one of those women on those boards have been successful in bringing in another diverse board member. So here's Dr. Kellen. She does some research and realizes that the glass ceiling is actually most prominent at that middle manager level, the level that every single one of you is most likely in. They're the people who make things happen. And it makes sense that it's most prominent there, right? Because these are the people who are responsible for the majority of a workforce population, whether it's an employee, contingent staff, bringing in alumni, right, working for interns. So when I came to this, how do we solve it? Because you can imagine after a decade of only looking at the problem, I was kind of ready for a solution, because nothing's going to change. It's going to continue to be 217 years. That we focus in there. So we focused in on the HR system, right, which is essentially not just for the HR department, but what we use to manage our people. It's what fuels our PLM systems, right? It's what fuels the people who are involved in the supply chain, what they do, and the projects. And we had to identify those key decision points that were most important when it came to equity in the workplace. We started with gender just because that's where the majority of research is. That's because that's where the majority of SAP's customers were focusing in on. I'm sure many of you know from managing projects, large and small, that there's a war for talent. It's incredibly hard to get really good, skilled people who aren't crazy, right, to work on our stuff. So it's difficult. But the truth is, it might be a war for talent, but it's not a shortage of talent. In the US alone, there are 85 million unfulfilled jobs, but yet I think all of us know somebody who's looking for a job, who has the skills. Our challenges are unconscious bias. We go to the same rooms, talking to the same people about the same stuff. Yeah, so didn't Einstein say that was the definition of insanity when we expect a different outcome? So more research we did using gender, but absolutely what we found in our testing is these kinds of decisions are applicable regardless, right? Of differently abled, of race, of probably one of the most important besides race, which is economic class, right? Very big deal. And we identified these key decision points where technology, by the way, can help us interrupt the decision and address those 150 different unconscious biases. So we focused in on human capital management technology again, which integrates with the systems that you use to manage the resources, to manage the projects to completion, right? Really big deal here, and combines with other enterprise data like project money, right? Funds, all of that kind of stuff. So the first thing is, how do we actually set a system up? For the first time in recorded history, we have 5 generations at work. We've never had that before, ever. In 2 more years, it'll be 4 generations, 75% of whom will be millennials. And let me tell you, they are different. Growing up in tech in the last, decade or so, we've been obsessed with millennials and their focus being digital natives. Ridiculous. Having consumer grade, right, experiences when we go to work, super important. And what I found and talking on the university circuit, and especially it hit home at another university just down the street, Northeastern, a few months ago, that the expectation of millennials and Gen Z, which nobody knows what to do with Generation Z yet, is that, yeah, the digital thing's important, but why are we still talking about that? Millennials have had enough experience in the workforce, and our young folks, Gen Z, who are out there doing internships, right, getting real experience, they're realizing the challenges that are out there in the workforce. And they now have an expectation of inclusion. I'm getting questions by these young people who don't want to be employed by you, they want to partner with you, that don't want their lives to start when they check out, right? Everything they do. And by the way, I'm a Gen Xer, and I feel this too. No matter how I spend my time in my life, I want to bring my whole self to work. I want to be able to be authentic, and I don't want to wait for my life to start. For vacation, for when I finally log off, and let's face it, nobody ever really logs off, or when I retire, and I know I never will. So what does that tell us? It tells us that we can't possibly live in a one-size-fits-all anymore. So how we structure our business, right? What does the foundation look like? Certainly we need to have hierarchical structures, but we're actually going beyond matrix now, which is what, the world we've all been living in, right? As we're staffing our projects and all that fun stuff. We're actually moving toward what's called networks of teams. It's a global talent economy that's changing. So your work, if it hasn't already, is going to be changing significantly. You have people that are coming together for a certain period of time. They may or may not be employed by your organization. They work on something, they leave, and they go somewhere else and go with a whole new set of people. It's fascinating. So we can't possibly manage that talent with the current, quite frankly, rigid infrastructures we have. And we have to stop focusing in on resilience as well. Very big supply chain term, I know. We have to instead focus in on flexibility and agility, right? Super important. So we need to rethink how we structure those systems that make it possible to have equity, to have each of you have the tools that you need to be able to have inclusive programs around your projects where the end users are represented in every single stage of development, implementation, and rollout. And then record keeping. And this one's particularly difficult, especially with those of you who do business in Europe are most likely familiar with GDPR. It's a very big deal, right? It's the first very big data protection policy regulation from any set of government. It's changed the world, and it's a big deal. If that Facebook Cambridge thing happened just in this month, 10% of Facebook's revenue would have went out the door into the regulators. It's a big, big deal. And essentially, what that data policy stuff does over in Europe is in the US, we're an opt-out culture. We're automatically signed up for everything, which is why we get so much spam, right? So many weird phone calls. In Europe, you have to now give explicit permission to have your data used. Imagine having a network of teams approach around that, right? Really difficult. And that's also the same for customers, partners, all that stuff, where you have to be able to say, here's my type of data, the regular data, name, address, as well as more sensitive data such as gender, economic class, whatever it might be. So we have to be careful with the record keeping. But we can't stop just looking at people in terms of revenue per person, in terms of, I don't know, staffing rates. That doesn't really tell us a lot of information. And quite frankly, that information isn't actionable. It doesn't tell me what managers are achieving the goals that they have for their organization and who isn't, what kind of tools that they need, right? Super important. And when you are managing large projects, for example, you may have one challenge in one area of your project and have a different type of challenge in another, right? We need to be able to capture that data to give managers the tools that they need to create the best organization, the best network of teams that they need in order to exceed or at least meet what they have for their goals. And then, so that's more infrastructure. And then it comes down to what are those decisions that each of us make every single day that are fueled by unconscious bias and create unintentionally inequity. The first one that we found was who applies. How many of you have written a job requisition? Yeah, most of us have. It's a pretty rote activity, right? It tends to be, let's face it, copy and paste. And the challenge that we have is because it's rote, because we know we have to fill that position pretty quickly, most of us do because we'll lose it the next quarter if we don't. It's not something we think a lot about. And we have the best intentions. We want more diverse candidates. Gosh, living in technology for the last 20-something years, I can't tell you the number of times I heard, well, Patti, I hire more people of color, more women, more fill in the blank, but they're just nowhere to be found. Why? Because they're going in the same rooms, talking to the same people about the same stuff. There are job descriptions, and job descriptions have words in them. There is a ton of research on the unconscious bias of words, what we write and what we read. There are millions of words, believe it or not, that are racially driven, that are gender discriminatory, that are differently able discriminatory. Some of the easiest ones out there, developer job recs tend to be written in bro code, right? You're gonna kill it and we're gonna eat pizza and it's gonna be great, right? And then nurses or teachers, it's all about loving and warmth and caring. I don't know, some of the best male nurses some of the best nurses I've had have been men, some of the best teachers I had have been men, some of the best developers I know have been women. Your biology does not dictate what you are meant to do. Words matter. So as an example here, how technology can be used is to have the machine learn the language that's discriminatory, right? That's not yielding a different set of applicants in your applicant pool. And again, think about how important that applicant pool is moving forward as we continue to go toward a network of teams where people know that they have the power to decide who they partner with and who they don't, right? Very, very important. So here I am, I put in my job description, the machine pops up and says, hey, did you mean to say these things? How about doing these words? And oh, by the way, let's do it in the context of the market, because let's face it, not everybody's purpose is like mine. Not everybody is there to go solve the world's inequity problems, right? But what we do want to do is get those projects done, get them done on time, right? Be able to do all the stuff we're supposed to do. I'm not waking up in the morning and wondering who's going to oppress me today or who I'm going to oppress, right? I just want to do my job. So that means I need context. So combining this type of data with enterprise and external data to find out how many other positions are like this in the market, in the industry, in the geographic region, what's the typical pay for these areas, right? Just very typical information you bring together. You're not changing what you do. You're using technology for decision interruption to change how you do it. It's called a nudge. The next one is who is hired, right? So we have this population of people. You're watching and seeing who drops off in that applicant talent pool. And then it comes to who is hired, unconscious bias. I want somebody who's extremely diverse, who's going to bring an opinion to the table I didn't expect, or my team, but oh, by the way, I'm going to hire this person because I'm creating a mirrorocracy because that person looks like me. And yes, I said mirrorocracy, right? The person in the mirror. So the who is hired, again, you have these great candidates. They've gone through the cultural assessments. They've gone through the behavioral assessments. We, of course, have gone through the skill assessments. We've also gone through potential. Important data point here. When a woman doesn't know something, she takes a class. When a man doesn't know something, he takes a job. Why? Because women are hired for their experience and men are hired for their potential. It's an unconscious bias. So using technology that takes all that stuff away, the place I live, the biology that I identify with, how amazing is that? Nudge, nudge, nudge. You said you wanted this outcome. You said you wanted this impact. How about these candidates, right? So using that technology, no blame and shame like I did to those lovely audience members. The next is how people are managed. Research shows us that women tend to get vague feedback. It's especially so in the last 24 months. The Me Too movement, the Time's Up movement, it's very hard to be a male and quite frankly a white male these days. More phone calls I'm getting now are from very uncomfortable male leaders and those who support them who are doing nothing wrong. It's a hard place to be. Men get very specific feedback. You do these 3 things and go meet these people, right? It's wonderful. And then they get promoted. And women get bad performance reviews because of the vague feedback. And it's not just by male managers, it's by female managers. We are conditioned. So using technology to be able to say things such as, okay, so there are these people who are doing kind of the same things, have similar goals. This one's been sent on a high potential path, top talent path of investment, and this one hasn't. Let's figure out why. No blame and shame, nudging. The next is who is developed. Same thing. When we go through succession planning, right, and essentially we are identifying the leaders of tomorrow, which is what a transformational leader does. Their responsibility is to raise the next generation of leaders. We fill out our succession plan. The system comes up and says, Susan's been having incredibly great reviews and amazing work performance over the last 3 years, but she's not named as a successor for this key influencer position. It's all these folks. And then the system says, oh, but she went on maternity leave. And yes, the motherhood penalty is very real, whether you have had children or not. I was color-coded in peach during my childbearing years. Seriously. I was not offered promotion. I was not offered pay increases. I was not offered mobility. I went out and did it anyway. But it's crazy. And by the way, as a manager at that time, I understood why. Working in a German company where you take a year off for maternity leave and you can't fill that position. I get it, right? But that goes back to structure of a business. So being able to address those unconscious biases around who is developed is kind of a big deal. The next piece is the developed component. How do you actually? Men get championed and advocated for, women get mentored. I am a 48-year-old woman. I've been in the workforce for a while. I don't really need to be mentored. Mentoring is perfect for people with 10 years or less experience. We have to think about the choices we make when we invest in the people around us. No blame and shame. The next is who is rewarded and recognized. 217 years until there's parity among the gender. Women tend to have 80% of the pay that men do. Not because men are jerks, not because HR are jerks, but because that's just what the system does. We have to change that. We also have to remember that there is no one size fits all. So as you're staffing your projects, as you are leading your teams, Know that this young Gen Z woman is going to have a very different need in terms of supporting who she is and who her life is than probably I would or you do. One size does not fit all. And when you work with human beings, you have to work with the total human being. We are transformational. We based on relationships. We're not transactional give and take. The next is who is promoted. This one's pretty critical. You can tell a lot about a company by who's at the top, can't you? Make no mistake, talent is looking. They don't believe you unless they see who is at the top. And then finally, having the mechanism from which each one of us in this room, right, not just the people at the top, but each one of us in this room has the insight into who leaves, when, and why. And the importance there is what? We can address what isn't working. That's how you disrupt a system. So it's the end of the talk. You guys have made it through your Friday morning. And you might be wondering, this is really great information, thanks. What the hell am I supposed to do with it? I'm going to tell you, each one of you here runs projects, right? Net new innovations, implementations, things that change how people interact with each other, things that change how we work, how we live, what we use, what we consume. You have the opportunity to identify people who are diverse, whose voice must be included. You can do that. Now that you know where unconscious bias lives, you have the opportunity to interrupt not only your decisions, but the decisions of the people around you. And the men in the audience, I'm here to say this. It's very hard to get involved on the topic of equity when you are not part of an underrepresented class, but we need you on this topic. We welcome you on this topic. We have a seat at the table for you on this topic. We made room for you, and we've made room for your friends. Women listen to women. Men listen to men. What I ask each of you, when you're sitting in this room today, when you're back at your desks on Monday, you look around you, you talk with your friends, you talk about the importance of this. You don't have to do it as part of an equity flag, just as part of a, isn't it time that we harness all the best and available talent kind of tagline. Look at the people around you who are high potentials, or you believe are high potentials, that have done some incredible work. Take them out to lunch, introduce them to other people in your organization. Open the door for them because you have the keys to that door. Look around you for people who you believe are being overlooked, who haven't quite discovered their voice to create a platform like the incredible women I've been able to work with, and truly the platform I've been able to create. You step up for them. You acknowledge and recognize the incredible work that they do, because when you do that, you set the tone, you provide the example for the people around you to do the same. That is the only way we are able to open the door for all talent, no matter their gender, no matter their race, their lifestyle, they're differently abled, no matter who they are, that they are able to thrive. Thank you.
Thank you, Patti. Thank you very much. It was a very, very good presentation. We do have time for some questions. I'll start off first with an unconscious bias, which I had within the context of PMiP. It's probably 7 years ago or 6 years ago. Some of you might have been there. We had a panel on accidental project managers. They were all accident. That was the topic. in project management, most people come in as accidental project managers, and what kind of skills and competencies do they, should they have to quickly ramp up?
Right.
And on the panel, I had 4 people. Guess who they were? All of them were men. So what happens is at the end of the conference, I always send out a survey, hey, tell us how to improve this. And the response I got from a project manager or a senior VP or something from Disney in LA, she might still be online, she joins us every year, was that I am disappointed that on that panel on accidental PM and skills, you had all 4 men. 7 years in a row. It was unconscious bias.
Yes, of course. Yep.
I had no idea that that was the case. I mean, it's a volunteer-driven event, and that's what happened. So it's something that you have acknowledged, you have underscored that very, very well. I think it's an excellent speech. But before I move into my thank you gift here, can I pass this on to anyone else for questions or comments? All right, thank you.
Thank you. That was really interesting, and I really like listening to any presentation on this topic. My question for you is, are you aware of any men presenting on this? Because to your point, men listen to men, and there's often a lot of executive and upper management men that come to conferences, and curious what your answer is.
Yeah. So, yeah, there are very few of us, right? Very few men as well. Vivek Wadhwa certainly does a significant amount of work in the startup community. There's a man, his name's Jeffrey something, but his website, his book is called Why, the letter Y Women. And I love what he does. He starts off his keynote with a bunch of shoes. They're all like black business shoes. And he walks on stage with red pumps. And he talks about, that's what it's like. What kills me about it, though, is we have so much research, right? If I see one more report that says why I belong in a boardroom, I'm going to kill someone, right, or scream. But he's able to use that same research that those of us who have been using it over the last years to, deaf ears, and his counterparts will listen to him. I don't care what it takes. I will tell you, I've been fortunate enough to do a lot of work in DC and represent technology businesses and large businesses on the topic of equity, not just gender, but overall. The overall feeling of what you might imagine, and no offense, and I'm sorry because I'm going to offend a bunch of people, but it's all old, male, stale, and pale. And what they come back with, think about all the stuff they have going on, right? The tax and trade challenges, the shortage of talent, of course, is one of them. But the automatic reaction to this topic, regardless of underrepresented population, is, didn't we deal with that already, right? It's unconscious bias fatigue. It is so important that we have males. There aren't enough, but it's those folks who are inviting other people in. The other thing we have going for us is because we've had so much momentum over the last 2 years around Me Too, around Time's Up, where men are starting to step up and say, I might not have a daughter, but this is an economic imperative. McKinsey found that if we paid women currently in the workforce, not additional women, but currently in the workforce, on par with their male counterparts, it would add $18 trillion to the global economy. That's more than the combined GDP of the UK, France, and Germany. It's significant. People want to do business and make money. They're all starting to come, especially as they're starting to see the returns, but it does take other influential men. Great question.
Thank you for your talk. In some organizations, there's a will to, bring diversity. However, you can also witness parallel to this, the growth of bro culture. So I'd like to know what your take is on the evolution of bro culture within organization.
Yeah, it's the new old boys club, isn't it? So the truth is, cultural change, you need 4 things to enable that. Because bro culture is essentially an unconscious bias that's gone out of control, right? It's representative of who's in charge and, quite frankly, the talent they believe they need to move their companies forward. And let me just, before I get to the levers of cultural change, which are necessary, so lots of my friends, gender, just overall equity and diversity and inclusion consultants go into large organizations who are fearful of the bro culture, right? Whether it's from a management perspective, but mostly they're dealing with it with tech. There's a lot of nervousness around that, especially as companies go to AI and, gee, who programs the algorithms? Oh, that's right, people, right? And we've seen all the outcomes of that. So what they have found over the last few years, they go in, they get hired for a company to figure out how to not have a bro culture, how to have diversity, but more importantly, change their culture to be inclusive. And the first thing you do as a consultant is a current state assessment, right? Where do we stand today? Where's the temperature of the room? So they interview people from the top to the bottom, from the bottom to the top. What they find and what gets the ear of the CEOs, right, of the decision makers that you were talking about, was when they find out that the young white millennial men might like the bro culture, but what they don't like is where that bro culture leads. To the old boys network, where success is defined by the number of divorces you have, the amount of cigarettes you smoke, the alcohol you drink, right? They look up and they say, I don't want that life. That's not for me. So there's a cultural change there. The challenge is we're going back to old behavior. And that's because we do not use the levers of change. The first is role modeling. And this is, by the way, for any cultural change, not just for this topic. Role modeling. I see people of influence, positional power, or they just have a big voice and we all listen to them. They're walking the walk, they're talking the talk, and they do it in a way that's not only overt, but also subtle. The decisions they make, the stuff they're talking about, right? I can visibly see the people I look up to. The next is compelling stories. I used to be part of this bro culture. I felt like I belonged. It was really great. Now I see that I'm part of a broader community. I was like this, I'm now like that, and it's wonderful, right? It goes back to we listen to our peers, people who we can identify with. They look like me, they think like me, they understand me, they're at a similar level, right? Whatever. The next is skills. There's a lot of talk about upskilling now in the workforce. We all know that, we're all part of that, and it's not just the hard skills, the vocational component, but it's also around transformational leadership, the softer skills. We are not giving people that upskilling. But the final piece where companies really fall down and where the bro culture is allowed to permeate is reinforcement mechanisms. We are telling people to change. And by the way, if I pointed at you and said change, you'd probably give me a different finger in response, right? People don't change when you tell them to. They change when you enable them to. You need the reinforcement mechanisms, quite frankly, the money, the bonuses, the getting promoted, the getting on a succession plan, that reinforces the new behavior, not the old behavior. And only then will it change.
So I recently listened to a TED Talk about business acumen or business sense, and basically how a lot of women can't move from that middle management up into the executive level because of the lack of training from their management. There was a quote for women get taught, what they need to do and get mentorship, and men get taught the business. Do you have any additional thoughts on how women can break out of that middle management up to the executive level, or how we as managers can help people move that way?
It's a great question. So once you kind of start the climb, and by the way, not everybody wants to be CEO, right? Not everybody wants to be chairman. So this is, not only up that way or kind of going and doing whatever you want. Did you know, and none of you will be surprised, that 90% of recruiting decisions are made from referral? 90%. Amazing. The higher you go, it's 100%. So what can you do? Stop teaching women how to create a better PowerPoint, how to do those hard skills, introduce them to people, advocate for them, going back to men get championed and advocated for, women get mentored. So each of us personally can do what I asked you to do. Go into a room, talk to people about her. Wow, that project sounds great. Susan has great experience, but not only that, it's the area in which she wants to go in. Introduce them to people who can introduce them to people, but not just transactionally. Get them in projects where they meet new people, where you can witness the work that they do. And this is not just for women, this is for any talent. The work that they do, how they do, so that we can see the impact. So that's with women. But remember what I said, women don't need to be fixed. And when I hear stuff like that, I want to choke the person who did the speech because it's wrong, right? It's just like Lean In. How many of you have read Lean In or heard of Lean In? My book, Disruptors, is the anti-lean in, because quite frankly, if I leaned in anymore, my face would hit the ground, right? It's just not working. It's not moving the needle. What we really need are to use those 4 levers that you just asked me about to train leadership. Talent doesn't look like you. While we do that and we reinforce that behavior with pay, you have the power to open the door for someone else. And I really hope you understand that it's also okay to open the door for yourself. One of the biggest things I hear from women is, I know I should be part of the sisterhood, but I'm really just going for my own promotion, my own opportunities. I feel so selfish. I feel so embarrassed. And I rarely hear that from them, but I do sometimes. And my response to that is, but don't you understand? When you open the door for yourself, you are holding it open and paving a path for the person who comes behind you. Those subtle things make a difference. Introduce them to people who will introduce them to people. Advocate for yourself, and then share your stories and introduce the people you met along the journey as well. It's a great question. Yeah, good luck with that. I'm on stage, I'm not getting off. Yes. Yeah.
Yeah, I had kind of two parts. The first was if you had found any like compound impact from intersectionality, like what it means to be a woman,
Yes.
and part of the LGBT community,
Yes.
and a person of color,
Yep.
or
Yep.
The impact that had. And then the second question was, I've heard, and this obviously came from a male manager in the past, that sometimes when women get into leadership positions, they're actually much more critical of women coming behind them
Yeah.
because they want to have somebody as good as them. And so this individual is saying that sometimes it's easier to get behind men because they're like, oh, well, you're the first woman or whatever. And how do you respond to that? I guess?
You change the conversation, right? You hear that a lot. So let me address the first thing. Intersectionality is critical. And what she's talking about is when you get a bunch of underrepresented traits and you bring them together. Woman of color who is LGBTQ, the most underrepresented population that there is. It's crazy. Women of color leave the workforce 6 times the rate of men. White women leave at 3 times the rate of men. Why? Because back to unconscious bias, regardless of how well they perform, they have to prove themselves over and over again. There's a ton of research on that. And yes, the impact is amazing. Just look at the data. The challenge we have is we don't have the data to help us understand what's working and what isn't. And quite frankly, we don't for this topic overall. So it's also always about entrepreneuring your way, right? Figuring out what works. But it goes back to addressing those unconscious biases, which are amplified the more intersectionality you have. The danger that we have with intersectionality is with diversity, when only focusing in on, let's get these people that fit all of these different traits, and then they leave. So yes, there's a ton there. We're paying attention to it. We are trying to change. I have unconscious bias because I'm a white woman, right? I don't know what it's like. I'm having a hard time empathizing. Big area of focus. Why? Because guess what? These are folks with degrees and talent and a voice and skills. We need to. That's number one. Number two, to answer your second question, that's called the queen bee syndrome. And it is, I am up here and you're staying down. It's kind of bullshit because that is with the assumption of there's only room for one woman at the top. I have had the benefit of working with some incredible women and some jerk women, but by the way, I've worked with jerk men as well. What you can do is change the conversation and share your own experience. Well, I've worked with so-and-so and she's advocated for me. Why do you think this is happening? What's in our culture that makes this possible? Why do you think so-and-so is tearing it down? Change the conversation. Otherwise, that cattiness will be perpetuated. BJ's not allowing another question.
All right. We like to be on track here. So thank you very much. So,
Thank you.
So Patti, I mean, I know she has, a lot of you don't know, or probably no one knows, she's had a very personal situation last week, and she's still here despite it. I didn't want to give the details. All
My
right.
father passed away. We buried him 2 days ago.
Yeah, so
Yeah.
she's still here.
Yeah,
so,
sad.
you know. So
Thank
thank
you
very
so
much.
much.
Excellent session.
Thank you.